Hey folks, thanks very much for joining us today. I'm Simon Kemp from Data Reportal, and today I am very excited to join Kalvin Bahia from GSMA Intelligence, who has been one of our longest standing partners in the Global Digital Report series that we produce at Data Reportal. Everything mobile, and a fascinating source of both stats and insights. And Kalvin has been one of my go-to people for the last, 5 or 6 years, Kalvin, since we first met?
I think that's about right, yeah.
Yeah. So every time I want to know what's happening in the world of mobile, Kalvin is the person that I turn to first. And the exciting news is that Kalvin and the team at GSMA Intelligence have just published their State of Mobile Internet Connectivity Report for 2021, full of fascinating insights and great data. I confess that I spent quite a long time nerding out and going through the amazing stuff that you and the team have put together. So today, what I'd like to do, Kalvin, if it's all right with you, is to dig into some of the finer points of that report and just get some of the context behind the numbers, perhaps, and also a sense from you of where you guys see the future of mobile development, especially as we're entering a new year.
That sounds great. Looking forward to it, Simon. It's actually my first Fireside chat, so I'm very excited about it.
Good stuff. So I think the thing that I really pulled away from the latest edition of your SOMIC report, which is something you've been producing for a few years, right? So this is not the first edition of the report, but I think in the latest report that you published, it shows that more than half of the world, the total population, is now using the mobile internet, which is obviously a really important milestone. Lots of exciting stuff to do there. What does this change about the way we need to think about the mobile internet? Now that we've passed this magical halfway mark, what does this mean for us as individuals, as organizations, as governments, and even as society? What's the key takeaway from this important milestone?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Simon. I can think of two particularly relevant points. So one is, and it's easy to sort of not consider this but I think the internet is such a personal experience. So how I use the internet, I use my fixed connection mostly for work. I use my mobile predominantly reading the news, looking for watching YouTube, and obviously making calls and using WhatsApp. How you might use it is different. How a lot of people worldwide use it is very different as well, especially for those people who in a lot of low and middle income countries, the majority of people who access the internet only do it on a mobile device. So they're doing a lot more work. They're doing, a lot more, living a lot more of their life just on the mobile device. So I think how people use it is going to be really important to understand. And obviously, especially since COVID, we know it's become even more important to people's daily lives. But again, what people want to do with the internet can vary. So we can distinguish between people who are online the majority of the day versus those that may not be able to afford to, or may not be able to access it for a certain period of time. But at the same time, there may be reasons for that. Maybe they don't need to access the internet for as long as other people do. So understanding how people use the internet, I think, is one of the most interesting and fascinating things we can do going forward. But it's not quite the same as, we generally have the view that more people that are connected are a good thing. And, the 51% tracking that over time, it's grown quite significantly over the last few years, if we see it in our reports. That's generally something that's not easy to measure, as you well know. There's a lot of different data points, a lot of different views, but it's easier to measure than how people actually use the internet. But I think that's going to be really important going forward to understand.
So you mentioned there, like, you're tracking it over a number of years. In terms of the growth rate that we're looking at, how much has that increased over the last 12 months or so in terms of that access rate? So just past the halfway mark, are we still seeing that growing rapidly?
Yeah, so what we've seen in the last few years, we've seen a reasonably consistent growth in mobile internet adoption. So as you said, it's 51% this year. Every year it tends to increase by 2-3 percentage points. So it was around 49% last year, and it was similar growth the year before. To some extent, it was a little bit unclear what we were expecting in 2020 with COVID. Obviously, that pushed a lot more people to do things more online. At the same time, as I'm sure we'll discuss later, there are a lot of barriers to getting people online. But what we tend to find in this report is those who were what happened in 2020, and this may change going forward because the pandemic is far from over yet, but the people who are already online were doing a lot more, using a lot more data, doing a lot more things with their device and the internet more generally. But in terms of bringing new people online, at least from what we've seen so far, that didn't really accelerate, as it were. It's still kind of the same, I guess, what you might say on trend growth that we've seen in the last 3-4 years.
That's really interesting, isn't it? I think a lot of people kind of perceived that there would be this perhaps push as a result of COVID and the fact that there was the need to do so many more things online than we had done previously, then it might have brought a lot more people into the internet world than perhaps had been there before. I'm guessing the people that don't currently use the internet that are able to, so we'll talk a little bit about infrastructure later, but from what I understand of the report, the vast majority of the world is in an area which is covered by broadband connectivity, but they, for whatever reason, do not yet use it. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Have you got any sort of, I think just sort of trying to unpack what that means. I'm guessing that a lot of that isn't by choice. It's not that people have access and just choose to ignore the internet. In terms of you saying that you're an enthusiast for the internet, I'm also unapologetically very much for getting as many people onto the internet as want to use it. So I think, I look at the fact that we're past the halfway mark and that gives me optimism. But at the same time, I know that, that means that there's still 49% that aren't using it. Some of those are very young children, obviously, and some of them are older people that may not want to use the internet. Within that group that are covered by the necessary infrastructure that want to use the internet, what are we looking at in terms of the big barriers here? Why is it that 51% is encouraging, but obviously it's not quite where I think a lot of people would want it to be? The United Nations has stated that basic internet access is a human right. So from that perspective, what are some of the barriers that we need to overcome to get more people online?
Yeah, very good question, and that's something we delve quite in detail in the report. And actually, one of the very useful data sources we have on this is over time. I think over the last since 2017, we have a consumer survey where we've been tracking in a number of markets those who use the internet and how they do it. But for those who aren't connected, we're trying to understand what are the key barriers that stop them using it, and then we also complement that in other research. And for those that aren't using, well, there's twofold. One, for those who aren't using mobile at all, so they don't have a device, we ask consumers, what is it that's stopping you, or what's the reason that you're not doing it? And then those that might have a device but aren't using the internet, we say, what's the reason? In terms of accessing a device itself, the most commonly cited reason is around the device cost and the cost of getting a handset. When we ask about why you're not using the internet at the moment, we have a range of responses. The ones that are most commonly cited, especially what's the most important barrier, they're around digital skills and literacy. So not being able to read and write, not being able to use a phone to access the internet. That tends to be more cited than others. The affordability barrier is kind of the next most cited. And actually affordability is something we track over time. And obviously we, as you're probably familiar with, we are seeing much cheaper devices on the market, especially in a lot of sub-Saharan African countries, South Asia. You can get an entry-level smartphone now for $30. A smart feature phone you can get for $20, in some markets even less. That's still a lot of money for a lot of people, especially as a one-off purchase. So there's obviously still issues around there. So those are the two that are the most commonly cited. In terms of the other ones, there's an issue around lack of relevant content or not knowing what's there. So actually, you sort of mentioned a lot of people may not feel they need to use the internet. I mean, one of the things when you ask this question, a lot of people do say, I don't really need to use it. But is it that they don't need to use it? That could be true. Or maybe they just don't quite know how they might be able to use it or what they could use it for. So that's another one, and another one that's particularly prevalent in some countries. Interesting, particularly in the countries we survey in Latin America, are concerns around safety and security. So things around ID theft and harassment. We see that as something that's obviously quite important to a lot of people going forward as a reason not to use it. But in certain countries, as I say, especially in the Latin America region, we tend to find that cited a little bit more, whereas things like affordability and skills in a lot of African and Asian markets, that's really where those barriers are more concentrated.
Fascinating. There's so much to unpack there. I've got a million questions coming out of all the things you've just said there. Let's start with literacy, because it's a topic that you have talked about in a variety of different reports over time, you as Kalvin and you as GSMA Intelligence. So I know that it's a topic that you've probably spent a lot of time looking at. I'm curious to understand, in terms of those literacy challenges, I almost feel that this is a bit of a catch-22, because especially if you look at the last couple of years and things like COVID, the amount that we've relied on the internet to deliver education to younger audiences, it's become very clear that this is a core opportunity for extending learning opportunities. If that's a barrier to people even coming into the internet environment in the first place, how do we tackle that? And I think, is this a concern around fear, or is there a more sort of physical barrier to the ability to read and write, stops people from, for example, being able to take out a phone contract, and therefore stops them even getting into the system in the first place? Is this a barrier in terms of actual being able to use the device, or is it being able to come into the ecosystem in the first place?
Yeah, good point. And I think it's a bit of both, and then a little bit more. So I think I mean, one of the things we do with literacy and skills, so barriers around not being able to read and write, as you say, I think that there's two issues there. One is actually, getting the contract or getting the mobile internet service, and then there's around, actually being able to use the device. But when you think about digital skills and literacy, it's a very, I'm trying to think of a better word, but it's very multifaceted and multidimensional. So if you think what you need to do to use an internet device, again, from our perspective, particularly from my background, it's not something you really think about. But in addition to literacy, it's the little bit of technical know-how, actually knowing how to use the device, how to, for example, do settings. In a lot of countries, knowing how to manage, switch off data and do data costs, how to manage things like privacy settings. There's that element. And then in terms of using the internet, whether it's, using a search function, using a certain app, all of those things come together. And what we've actually this year, we've got some results in the survey where we sort of tried to unpick at those things that consumers can report they can do and those that can't, and it varied quite a bit by country. So in a lot of countries, particularly in sub-Saharan African markets where there's some issues around there might be concerns around data costs, they were quite good at sort of managing data usage, but then in other countries that might have been less so. So it's addressing all of those, and one of the things that is quite challenging is, how do you measure digital skills, as it were? There's a lot of different research on that, and we can focus on basic literacy, but I think you rightly point out, in terms of how we deal with that, yes, obviously we want to get the whole world, fully literate and fully educated, but that's probably not going to happen in the immediate time frame, and that's not necessarily something that a lot of, whether it's mobile operators or telecom regulators and policymakers can do. They obviously have to work with governments on that angle. But I think, as you rightly point out, there's, especially now that in a lot of countries education is being delivered via online channels, what you do find is that digital can offer that opportunity to actually enhance literacy and education in itself. So in a lot of markets, in India, where you've seen some very low cost devices being made available, once people actually get a chance to use them, and once they either receive some training or how to understand them, that then offers an opportunity to actually learn how to use a phone and then access other literacy and digital skills. So in theory, hopefully they'll be reinforcing, but it really does. I sort of do this question a lot, and with various people, but it really does vary by country, and it really does vary by individual as well. So understanding the different dimensions of skills and seeing what's particularly important for some users and not others, that's I guess the key challenge.
Okay, makes a lot of sense. You mentioned India there. One of the things that we've been tracking in some of the other data that we report on, a company called GWI does a survey of internet users right the way around the world. And one of their findings is that there's been a big increase in the use of voice interfaces, especially on mobile devices in countries like India. Is that going to help us get past some of that literacy challenge, or is there still that initial being able to just even know that you can do that in the first place? Do you see voice as being something that's going to accelerate the accessibility of these devices for the less literate?
No, that's a good point. I think that's right. Whether it achieves really large scale in all countries is I guess another question. But certainly, as you say, in India we've seen that, and we're seeing that in other markets as well. And it's just for the reasons you say, in terms of overcoming that initial literacy barrier, coming up with services or training or ways in which to either use voice or make things more visual, and enabling people to use it if they a device if they can't read or write does allow them to use the device and get something out of it beyond that barrier. So I think you're right. I think that along with some of the other services being developed is definitely something that I think is quite promising.
Yeah. So on that one, I'd love to come back a little bit later in our conversation today. This could go on for a while, Kalvin. I'd love to come back a little bit later. The point you made about the relevance of content, because I find that fascinating. But before we get to that, I've still got a couple of questions just around the general accessibility of the internet. I think the stat that really stood out to me and shocked me, I'll be honest, I mean, I sort of looked at it, I could not get my head around this fact that you'd reported that almost a quarter of the world's population this is adults in lower and middle income countries, if I'm going to express the stat correctly. A quarter of adults in lower and middle income countries are unaware of the existence of the mobile internet. Have I got that correct?
Broadly, yes. It's being unaware that they can access mobile internet the internet on a mobile device. Yeah.
I just find that fascinating because this is possibly a naive perspective from somebody who's obviously from a position of privilege here, but just to the extent, we look at internet use around the world, and it's very clear that there's differing levels of access, but almost everywhere in the world, the internet has become a pervasive part of society in many situations. So this idea that people are still sort of, I suppose, unaware of some of the more basic aspects of even how to access it. How has this come about, and what do we need to do to address this so that we can get past some of these quite fundamental challenges?
It's a very good point, and it's a stat that wasn't just surprising to you. In fact, it's one of the ones that we often get either asked about or that spikes a lot of interest. It's worth saying, actually, it might seem somewhat shocking. The positive news is actually, well, depending on how you look at it, it's increased a lot over the last few years. So when we track this 2017 and 2018, that quarter that you say is unaware, that was over 40%. I think it was close to a half. So
Goodness.
actually it's come a long way. And what's also particularly positive is when you were looking at those who weren't aware of it, when you look at that gap closing, it's made up particularly by population segments that are often underserved, so especially, for example, women and those in rural areas. So in a lot of countries, their awareness was much less than half, but we've really seen that accelerate over the last 4 years. So there is a positive story there that it's one of the trends that's been going up, probably as you would expect as the internet's become more relevant. I think in terms of the challenges, it's worth thinking about. I can sort of think about this in a couple of segments. So there are those who are on particularly low incomes, particular rural areas. You think they don't have electricity access, they don't have access to infrastructure. You can see a scenario where the internet, it hasn't really affected or touched their lives. They're probably not aware of what it is. And that's one group which is, I think is going to be the most challenging group. But there's another group which I'm not going to call it low-hanging fruit because it's still a challenge, but there's an awful number of users in a lot of low middle income countries who are using a basic mobile device still. And again, if you think of how they use that, that's incredibly important for communication, reducing the time to access a lot of services. And remember, in a lot of these markets, you can use a basic handset, 2G, to use mobile money, which has been really important.
Yeah.
You still have a lot of those, but for them, the device is still it's a voice or SMS device. It's a mobile money device. They don't necessarily think about a mobile device as being something you might access the internet on. And that we'll touch on this a little bit later in terms of what GSMA operators are doing. But when we look at a lot of the digital skills initiatives going on, a lot of the initial focus, at least, is on those existing customers who have a device mostly focused on 2G, but with the lower cost of device now, hopefully they can consider upgrading to a higher level device and upgrading to 3G, 4G, maybe going forward 5G, and then access the internet. So it's that group there who actually they do own a device, but they're just not really, they don't really think about it as something that you would access the internet on. And I think that's a particularly relevant segment where I think we can drive more awareness. As I say, there's then the other group where I think there's a bigger challenge where there's just a general lack of infrastructure and probably have never used a basic phone rather than a smartphone. So I think, going forward, those are the two segments that'll be particularly interesting to keep an eye on.
So going back to that first group that you mentioned, and I appreciate this is possibly a little bit sensitive, and I am in danger of not being as informed as I would like to be. So I'm going to ask this from a position of naivety, perhaps. Where you mentioned that you've got a perhaps disproportionate number of women in rural areas from lower socioeconomic groups who currently access and even who are able to access the internet. How much of the current challenges are societal as opposed to perhaps technological and financial? Just in terms of, if we look at how we accelerate that move beyond 50% to 60, 70%, how much of this is about changing perspectives as opposed to changing a grasp of technology, for example?
Yeah, certainly a relevant factor. One of the things that we found in a lot of countries, particularly in a lot of South Asian countries, but in some countries in Africa as well, is, as you point out, there's the barriers we've mentioned, but there are social or cultural social or cultural factors that are relevant as well. Thinking of one example, when we ask why users aren't using mobile internet, for example, in Pakistan, a lot of men will typically report the ones we just mentioned, skills and affordability. Women will also report additional barriers around either not being allowed or due to family reasons, or typically not really being able to access a device. And we see that in other markets as well. So that's certainly a challenge as well. And when we talk about addressing the barriers to adoption, obviously it needs to be not just country specific, but looking at specific segments as well. How you bring that segment online is different to how you might bring the unconnected men online, or if you look at older populations who might not have access to internet who want to, there's probably a different issue there as well. So that's an ongoing challenge. There are initiatives, so I don't know the full details around this. So if someone wants to look it up, I should give enough information. So in India, for example, which has seen significant uptakes in mobile internet adoption in the last few years, especially because of the lower costs, some of the operators there have specific activities focused on getting women connected. So they will, for example, have women agents who can just sell or engage with women when selling the device, and also helping on sort of training and awareness, and then ensuring, addressing concerns around safety and security. Forget the name of the program now, but it's on the GSMA website. So there are those things there to try and address some of those specific barriers that are either felt more by women or rural populations than other segments.
We're looking at a fairly large chunk of the unconnected when we talk about those groups, right? This is not like a minority small segment. We're looking at double-digit percentage points of that remaining gap that fall into perhaps that area of challenge. Is that a fair assumption?
No, that's definitely right, and I think that's where you sort of get into the detail behind the 51%. So in the gender gap in low middle income countries, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, women are, I think, almost 40% less likely than men to use mobile internet. If you look at the rural areas in the same region, they're 60% less likely to use mobile internet than those living in urban areas. And what we found is in a lot of regions that's been sort of persistent over the last few years. So it's not something we're seeing falling. In some countries, particularly South Asia, so again, India being an example, quite a unique example given what's happened in the market over the last few years with the entry of Jio and having very low cost devices and mobile data plans. That's obviously been able to drive adoption up both across all segments. But it's why it highlights that need when sort of trying to, if we want to connect more people, having those sort of having both the evidence and the information to try and target those interventions where they're needed, and they may also differ as well.
So this is where I ask perhaps the most glib question of the day, but it's a follow-on from what you just talked about there. I was enthusing about the fact that the number of people that are not connected to the internet is going down recently, and I had a question which I confess stumped me when it was given to me. Why does it matter to connect everybody in the world? To be honest, the question was almost framed as, do we really need more people on social media posting photos of their lunch? And I think, depending on where you are in the world, you have a very different perspective of what access to the internet involves. Do we need to connect everybody? And it's a valid question, and I would love to hear your perspective on it.
No, it's a similar question that I've had as well, and also thought about. I kind of have two thoughts. I'm going to do the perhaps slightly, well, to some people more boring data response, but I think it's quite. Also, you brought it up first earlier. So as you rightly pointed out, when we sort of look at this 51% figure, we're looking at all the population. Now, do we expect every single person in the world, including babies and infants, to use the internet? Probably not, though. I've got two kids who've been using my phone since they were 1 year old, and they've had their own Kindle since they were 2. So no. But I guess the point is, we're unlikely to see, and I don't think we would expect this 51% to eventually reach 100, or or even close to it. And if we just looked at the adult segment, if we just looked at people aged 18 plus, you'd probably be looking at something between 60 and 65%.
Oh, really? That's quite a lot lower than I was anticipating. Okay.
Yeah. Well, again, yeah. Obviously, will vary by region, but I think globally, that's probably in the ballpark. But and actually, for this reason, when the Broadband Commission and the World Bank and others, they've set a goal by 2030 to bring universal connectivity in sub-Saharan Africa. But what they've actually defined that as is 90% of those aged 10 or above, in recognition of the fact that younger infants are less likely to use it, but also, as you say, a lot of people may not want or need to get connected. So yeah, I think that sort of wraps up the data point, which is that we're not going to see, and we wouldn't expect 100% connectivity, but obviously we do want to do a lot more. In terms of why this is important, so again, I'd sort of come back to my first point, which is that if you think how people use the internet, so as I say, on my side, on my mobile, it's predominantly social media, news and entertainment. But for a lot of in a lot of countries where mobile is the only way of accessing the device, even using things like WhatsApp, to communicate with suppliers or customers, it's really important from a business perspective, or being able to access health or education services, which we've seen increase over time. So, and what that's supported by plenty of evidence now, both by us, by organisations like the ITU, that show mobile growth has not just a link, but a causal impact on GDP growth. We've done some work with the World Bank recently that has shown that the expansion of mobile broadband has actually, for example, in Nigeria, lifted around 2.5 million people out of poverty. So these are really, so these are really, these are very tangible impacts on people's lives in terms of their livelihoods and their outcomes. So I think it's important to keep sight of that, and that's why when we're sort of tracking this figure, we generally say connecting more people over time is good for good for people's lives and good for the world more generally. I think the other thing, particularly on our research side, I think that part is so important that I think it does get the right focus. But I think it's also important not to lose sight of the fact that mobile internet it predominantly is for a lot of people a leisure good. So I think, as you said, as you rightly pointed out, do we need more people posting pictures on Instagram? It's not something I typically do, but I don't know why people watch things like Love Island or golf either. But that being said, last night I was in bed on my phone on YouTube watching goals from the 1986 World Cup. So this wasn't really the most productive use of my time either. But it's I think that's for a lot of people, that's what the internet is about. It's about leisure and entertainment. So if that's what if that improves people's enjoyment, happiness, well-being, then I think that it depends on your point of view, but I think it's important to consider that alongside, the more tangible things we think about in terms of economic growth, reducing poverty, improving things. The GSMA has also done a study around, the enabling effect of mobile use in reducing carbon emissions. I think that's obviously important going forward. So all of those things are really key to keep an eye on. But I think the leisure and entertainment side is, it's what a lot of people get connected for.
Perfect segue. Thank you for that. That brings us back to one of the points that you raised earlier, which is about the relevance of content. So I know that this comes up regularly, and it's come up in some of your previous reports too, about the idea that one of the barriers to people not taking up the opportunity to use the internet when they could do is this idea that there's not a sufficiently relevant kind of content out there. Given that there is an app for almost everything in our lives now, I'd love to get your perspectives on this. Is this a lack of knowledge of what's available? Is it partly fear manifesting as something else? Or is there something a little bit more practical that we need to consider, such as content not being available in local languages, for example? Just love to get your thoughts on this.
No, I think you really hit the two key points there. So what we see is, one of the more cited responses if we say, why aren't you using the internet, is don't need it, or nothing. There's nothing useful for me to access the internet. And I think you hit the 2 points quite well. So one is probably around awareness, which it doesn't affect just content. It can perhaps sort of affect things like affordability. So when people say a device costs too much, if you then sort of probe and say, how much do you think it is, they'll often say, well, it's, $200-300, maybe more. They may be thinking of the latest, iPhone or Galaxy, not realizing that actually you can get, something much cheaper. And I think this similar thing applies to content. It could just be a lack of awareness as to what is out there or what you can do. So I think that's one element. But again, I think the other factor, especially in some countries, things that we take for granted, where we can do most of our things online, whether it's accessing government services or accessing health or education services, that's not available in a lot of countries. I mean, one of the things we do look at, the UN has an e-government index or assessment that they do every 2 years, and they sort of rank the availability of different e-government services. And there's such a range. You obviously have the Scandinavian countries and South Korea that will always top these index rankings. But then you've got the other countries where, the amount of information or services available is much less. So that's, trying to improve that access to digital content is important, and governments obviously have a way in which they can try and stimulate and advance that. I think the other point you mentioned is also the accessibility in local languages. So I think, I haven't looked at this in a while, but the vast majority of mobile content or internet content is predominantly European-based languages, especially English. Obviously, in Japan and South Korea, there's a very vibrant ecosystem, and China as well. But in a lot of markets, in again South Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa, you have significant English-speaking or French-speaking populations that obviously have that, but for a lot of others who don't speak those languages, there's not nearly as much. And a lot of, again, it sort of comes down to sort of partly around the literacy, but a lot of the communication is done face to face or via voice as well, which I think sort of comes back to some of those new innovations you talked about that I think will be important. So I think the language issue is definitely an issue. Again, there is some positive news. So when one of the things we track in our mobile connectivity index is apps in new languages, and especially over the last few years, the number of apps that on both iOS and on Google Play that are being made available, for example, in Swahili, in a number of in Indian languages, has increased quite significantly. So I think we are seeing some improvements on there, but it's something that we'll have to carry on.
Right. Just picking up on your language bit in there, I think the data that we saw, admittedly, this is a little bit difficult to calculate, because knowing what qualifies somebody as a speaker tends to vary quite a lot from one source to the other. Are you looking only at fluent people versus people that can get by? In terms of the published content, and this is based on text-based internet content, English, I believe, is more than 60%, if not even more than that, of written content on the internet. And then you've got Spanish and a couple of others as well. Once you get into the sort of the the vernacular languages, if you like, across a lot of the countries where we see those lower rates of adoption. There's almost no written content there. But that does kind of then pose the question of, if this is only based on written content and literacy was a challenge in the first place, looking at something like video, for example, and this is one of the most fascinating things when you look at Geo, for example, in India, where they were developing a behavior by making data so accessible that the amount of time we saw people consuming video content in India was almost at the top of the world rankings.
Yeah.
In terms of your perspective on that, does this change the dynamic of the relationship that we have with mobile internet? If we move to a more video-based experience, does that have important implications for the future development of the internet on mobile devices?
I think you're right. Yeah, definitely. We've seen the same data. I think India's, on a per user basis, I think they consume more data than pretty much every country in the world, largely because of video.
Yeah.
But I think that's right. And actually, interestingly, you talked about sort of our partnership, which, we share. I know you source a lot of our data from us, but on your side, obviously, we get all of our social media data from you. And in the mobile connectivity index that usually accompanies our report, though we're going to be publishing the update early next year sometime. When we were trying to look at the ways in which to measure content, I mentioned some of the things we already look at. So availability of e-government services, looking at apps in local languages, those that are available, looking at number of websites. The reason actually when we were thinking about the other ones, we actually used your data on social media users, and there was a consideration that said, well, which one follows the other? Because if you use social media, by definition, you're on the internet. So is that really an enabler? And actually, the rationale was actually the more people in a country that are on social media, that is effectively a form of content creation. More people on, whether it's on WhatsApp or Facebook or whatever social media platform, they post content that is used and relevant to people. And I think we may touch on this later, but that's, social media is ultimately still one of the key drivers as to why many people in these countries get online. And I think going forward, especially as we see more people using 4G and move to 5G, as the capacity of networks increases, I think that video will become more important as well. So yeah, I think you're right, and I think that's borne out by the fact that when you look at what people are actually using mobile internet for.
You read my mind there when you referenced the increasing bandwidth of things like 5G. That's a very next question on the list of things I wanted to touch on. So I was stalking the data published by Ookla in their speed test website, which is sort of they update every month the average and the median speeds of connections in different countries around the world. Speed of that has increased by 20% in just 2 months. It's just incredible. So we're looking now at an average. This is average, obviously, so take with a slight pinch of salt here. There are some incredibly fast connections and some very slow ones either side of this, but globally, 68 megabits per second. Now, for the person that's sort of listening in and going, what does that mean? If you look at the bandwidth guidance from a company like Netflix, so streaming content, if you wanted to stream a 4K movie, Netflix recommends that you need to have at least 25 megabits per second connection. But if the average world sort of mobile connection is now 68, we can now stream 2 separate 4K movies with room to spare on our mobile connection. So I'm excited about the improving speeds on mobile devices, but we've now got to the stage where I confess I'm struggling to understand the benefit of being able to stream 3 4K movies instead of 2. I know 5G is a big deal, but for the average person on the street, what's the big takeaway here, other than you can stream multiple movies on your mobile device? What does this bring for the future in terms of new innovations and new opportunities?
Yeah, I should have a more comprehensive answer to this, because working at the GSMA, when I speak to my family and friends, when they hear 5G, they say, so should I get it and why? What's it going to mean for me? And and I should probably have a more comprehensive and better response than I do at the moment. But I think there's a couple of there's probably two parts to this. So obviously, the faster speeds, what they call enhanced mobile broadband. I think that's quite important, because what will come with that, in addition to the speeds, is the extra capacity in the network probably means more data offerings. So in a lot of countries that we're seeing 5G, data caps in the 4G era. On my side, I think currently my data limit is 5 gig. It's increased a little bit. On 5G plans, you're looking 50, 100 meg. In some cases, you're looking at unlimited data. So for those individuals who wanted to use quite high bandwidth services on the go, whether that was streaming or possibly gaming as well, that'll be less of an issue or a barrier doing it on the go. So I think I think that element will be probably in the immediate sort of future. That will be I guess one of the key use cases. I think the other thing, which is probably would be less well known to people who don't know much about 5G, is short to medium term. I think the opportunities around fixed wireless access, I think, will be a bit more tangible. So what I mean by that is, for those people who've got fixed connections, they may still be using ADSL technologies. Not many people will have fiber to the home, but in a lot of countries that's obviously being rolled out. But in many areas, getting a fiber to your house is either not possible at the moment or probably won't be in the future because it's quite expensive. Whereas using fixed wireless access, where effectively rather than the fiber you use a wireless link, with 5G technology should enable that by offering the faster data rates and more capacity. So for those who maybe lack more fixed connectivity on their side, I think that's, on my side, I won't necessarily see that because I have a fiber connection on my side, but I think a lot of people going forward, that will be quite important as well. In terms of the in terms of, I guess, maybe the more forward looking, there's probably two things to consider. So one is for consumers, I guess it's the service that isn't available yet. I think 20 years ago now, 3G was being launched in a lot of countries. It wasn't really till the iPhone came out that people were like, oh, okay, well, this is pretty good. I guess there's been, there was the fad of Pokemon Go, I think, a few years ago, where I guess everyone thought we were going to be using these new augmented reality games, which obviously died out. But augmented and virtual reality is one that obviously keeps coming up. And if someone develops that, I guess that killer or that popular app or device in the next few years, that could really spur it. So I think with something like 5G, when you build a technology, is often the use case sometimes follows. So I think that's on the consumer side. I think more generally, when people hear about 5G, they've probably heard the same buzzwords that you. Obviously, there's low latency, the massive IoT. They'll have heard things like what was the thing that I heard was seeing the other day? Things like precision agriculture, smart logistics, smart cities, remote object manipulation. I don't claim to understand most of those.
Was that from a list, Kalvin?
No, and there's people who know about these technologies more, that are more educated on this than I am, that say that some of these are possible. So I can't really say which of those will really scale. I think maybe the key thing to people who aren't familiar with 5G, I think one of the things that's quite exciting is around the use by businesses, both small, medium, and large. So a lot of the connectivity they had, a lot of the things they wanted to do may not have been possible with 3G, 4G, but is with 5G. So, if some of these things allows them to develop new services, could be in the healthcare sector, manufacturing sector, there's potentially use there. That's something that we may see going forward. It's probably, I could be wrong, probably not something you will see a tangible, impact on daily lives in the next year or so. But over the 5G era, which mobile technology cycles typically last around 10 years or just less, I think that's something that is often talked about with 5G that I think is relevant as well. So it's not just about what you do with the device; it could be the services that enables in other sectors that people use. But let's see. I guess that's one of the exciting things about working in the sector.
So hold that thought. I'm aware we could talk all day. I could certainly keep on asking you hundreds of questions. We haven't even touched on some of the really big topics that I'd like to, but I'm aware you have other important things to do with your day, and those important things are going to be beneficial to me. So I'm keen to let you get back to them as well. One last question for you, that just builds on what you were just saying just there. As Kalvin, so as an individual rather than your sort of official role or whatever else, knowing what you know about where mobile is today and where it's going, what are you most excited about for the next phase of mobile development?
Yeah, feel like if I knew that properly, I'd probably, or if I knew what was going to be the sort of the next big exciting big thing, I'd probably be doing something else and probably earning a bit more money with it too. I also probably from being an economist background, we're more sort of backward or current thinking. We often don't see what some of the more exciting things are. So a lot of the things I touched on, depending on who you speak to, both in the GSMA and the wider industry, the ability to use 5G for fixed wireless access, I think is important, and I think a lot of people will see that as a key use case going forward. Some of the ways in which it's used for enterprises is important as well. I guess on particularly on my side, on my research side, where we do a lot of work on trying to bring more people online, especially in lower and middle income countries. I think any sort of 5G use case that can help that, whether it's as I mentioned, fixed wireless access will be key. For me, for me personally, I mean, the one that I guess sounds pretty cool and that a lot of people talk about are around AR, VR. I don't really know, I guess there's been a lot of stop-starts in this area with things like Google Glass and a lot of things haven't taken off. But I guess that's something that will probably be interesting to keep an eye on.
Nerds think alike. I'm all for these like smart specs. I can't wait for that to actually become a reality. So yeah, great stuff. Kalvin, thank you so much. So just a little bit of a forward-looking thing. You and I are going to be working on the data for our upcoming 2022 reports, which we'll be publishing at the end of January. So I'm looking forward to nerding out from the insights that you and your team are going to be sharing with us. Like I said, I've still got loads more questions. So if it's all right with you, I'm not going to hold you to this, but could we have you back for another round of insights early next year once we publish those reports?
That sounds good. So you've got your digital reports, and we've got our mobile connectivity index. I think that's probably a good time to touch base again and see what's happened in 2021.
Sounds good. Super. Thank you so much for your time and your amazing insights. Really, really appreciate it. And I look forward to chatting to you again next time.
Thank you very much, Simon. Appreciate it.